At that time, regiments were responsible for supplying their own remounts, and the colonel had been authorized to purchase around 60 horses, which he hoped to acquire individually in French Navarre by leading his regiment to Toulouse, where we were to be stationed. But, as bad luck would have it, we arrived in Bayonne on the very day of that city's fair. There were many horse dealers present. The colonel made a deal with one of them, who immediately delivered the horses the corps needed. They could not be paid for on the spot, because the funds announced by the minister were not due to arrive for another 8 days. The colonel therefore ordered that one officer remain in Bayonne to receive the money and hand it over to the supplier. I was assigned to this cursed chore, which would later result in a very unpleasant adventure, though at the time I only regretted being unable to travel with my comrades. Still, despite the deep annoyance I felt, I had to obey. To make my return to the unit easier, the colonel decided that my horse would travel with the regiment, and that once I had fulfilled my mission, I would take the stagecoach to Toulouse. I knew several former Corrèze classmates in Bayonne who helped me pass the time pleasantly. The funds from the minister arrived. I received and paid them. My task was complete, and I began preparing to rejoin my regiment. I owned a Nankin dolman, trimmed the same way, with silver buttons. I had this fancy outfit made when I was on Bernadotte staff, where it was fashionable to wear such attire when traveling in hot weather. I decided to wear it for the trip from Bayonne to Toulouse, since I was not with the troops. So, I packed my uniform in my trunk and had it taken to the coach office, where I had reserved, and unfortunately paid for in advance, my seat. Since the coach departed at 5 in the morning, I instructed the hotel porter to wake me at 4 o'clock. The scoundrel promised to be punctual, and I fell asleep with complete confidence. But he forgot me, and when I opened my eyes, the sun was already shining into my room. It was past 8 o'clock. What a disaster! I was stunned. Then, after a fair amount of swearing and cursing the negligent porter, I realized I needed to make a decision. The coach only departed every 2 days, a major inconvenience, but that wasn't even the worst of it. The regiment's fund had paid for my seat, since I had stayed behind on official business, but it was not required to pay for a second one. And I had foolishly paid the fare all the way to Toulouse, so if I booked a new seat, it would be at my own expense. At that time, coach travel was very expensive, and I had very little money. Besides, how could I spend 48 hours in Bayonne when all my belongings had already left? I resolved to make the journey on foot. Leaving the city at once, I confidently set out on the road to Toulouse. I was lightly dressed, carrying only my sword slung over my shoulder, so I made good progress on the first leg of the journey and spent the night at Pérehorade. The good farmer did not stop there. He insisted that I stay with him until the storm had passed and offered me a snack. While we chatted, he told me he had once seen in Orthez a general named Marbot. I replied that he was my father and gave him a description. Then this kind man, named Bordenave, became even more courteous, insisted on drying my clothes, and offered to let me spend the night. I thanked him, but resumed the road to Orthez, where I arrived at nightfall, exhausted and sore all over. The next day, I could barely put on my boots, both because they were still wet, and because my feet were swollen. I managed to drag myself to Pau, where I was so worn out, I had to stop for the entire day. The only transport I found was the mail coach. Though the seats were very expensive, I took one to Gimont, where I was warmly welcomed by Mr. Dorignac, a friend of my father, at whose home I had stayed for several months after leaving Corrèze. I rested a few days with his family, then a stagecoach took me to Toulouse. I had spent 4 times the price of the seat I lost due to the hotel boy's negligence in Bayonne. Upon my arrival in Toulouse, I was about to look for lodging when the colonel informed me that he had already rented a room for me at the home of an old physician friend of his named Mr. Merlis, whose name I shall never forget, for that venerable man and his large family treated me not as a tenant, but as one of their own children during the 15 days I stayed there. The regiment was large and well mounted. We drilled often, which I found very engaging, even though I sometimes ended up confined to quarters by Squadron Commander Blancheville, an excellent officer and old soldier, under whom I learned the importance of precision and to whom I owe much in that regard. This commander, who had been an adjutant major in the Lunéville gendarme before the Revolution, was highly educated. He took a strong interest in young officers who had potential and, willingly or not, made them study their craft. As for the others, whom he called hard-headed, he would merely shrug when they failed to understand theory or made mistakes during drills, but never punished them for it. There were 3 second lieutenants he had singled out: Messrs. Gaviol, Desmonts, and myself. For us, he tolerated no imprecise commands and would confine us for even the slightest mistake. As he was very kind outside of service, we dared to ask why he reserved his severity just for us. "Do you think I'm foolish enough," he answered, "to waste time scolding a black man to make him white? Gentlemen, such and such are too old and lack the aptitude for me to bother perfecting their instruction. But as for you, who have all it takes to succeed, you must study, and study you shall." I never forgot that reply, and I applied it when I became a colonel. It's a fact that old Blancheville had read our futures quite well. Gaviol became a lieutenant colonel, Desmonts a brigadier general, and I became a divisional general. When I arrived in Toulouse, I had exchanged the horse I had bought in Spain for a charming Navarrese one, as the prefect had organized horse races for some local festival, though I forget which. Gaviol, who was very fond of racing, had entered my horse. One day, while I was exercising him on the greensward, he entered the narrow circle of the path, and, running straight ahead like an arrow, slammed his chest into the sharp corner of a garden wall. He dropped dead instantly. My comrades thought I was dead, or at least seriously injured, but by some miraculous stroke of luck, I didn't have the slightest scratch. When they helped me up and I saw my poor horse lifeless, I was heartbroken. I returned home in great sorrow, knowing I'd need to replace the horse and ask my mother for money, though I knew she was already struggling. Count d'Effermont, a minister of state, and one of our guardians, had opposed the sale of the few properties we still owned. Expecting peace to increase land values, he rightly believed they should be kept and the debts gradually paid off through strict economy. It is one of the greatest debts of gratitude we owed to good Mr. d'Effermont, my father's most loyal friend. I've always held his memory in deep respect. As soon as my request for a new horse was submitted to the Guardianship Council, General Bernadotte, who was part of it, burst into laughter, saying the tale was hilarious, the excuse well chosen, and clearly implying that my request was what later became known as a scam. But fortunately, my request was supported by a certificate from the colonel, and Mr. d'Effermont added that he believed me incapable of deceit to get money. He was right, for even though I had only 600 francs of pension, a salary of just 95 francs per month, and a housing allowance of 12 francs, I never incurred a single sou of debt. I have always hated debt. I bought a new horse, not as good as the Navarrese, but the general inspections ordered by the first consul were approaching, and I needed to be mounted promptly, especially as we were to be reviewed by the famous General Boursier, known for his strictness. I was assigned to go out and meet him with a detachment of 30 men. He received me kindly and spoke of my father, whom he had known well. That did not stop him from placing me under arrest the next day. The story is amusing. One of our captains, named B, a very handsome man, would have been one of the most attractive officers in the army had his calves matched the rest of his appearance. But his legs looked like stilts, which clashed badly with the tight Hungarian-style trousers worn by our chasseurs. To remedy this, Captain B had some sizable calf-shaped pads made, which completed his elegant silhouette. Now here's how those fake calves got me arrested. Though they weren't the only cause. Regulations required officers to leave their horses' tails natural, like those of the rank and file. Our colonel, Mr. Moreau, was always impeccably mounted, but all his horses had docked tails. Fearing that General Boursier, a strict enforcer of the rules, might accuse him of setting a bad example, he had false tails affixed to all his horses for the inspection, so skillfully done that only someone who knew beforehand could tell they weren't real. Everything was going perfectly. We began the drill, which General Boursier had invited General Suchet, Inspector of Infantry, and General Gouden, commander of the regional division, to observe, accompanied by a large, splendid staff. The session was long. Nearly all movements, done at a gallop, ended with rapid charges. I commanded the center platoon in Captain B. squadron, near which the colonel had positioned himself. They were just a few paces in front of me when the generals approached to compliment Mr. Moreau on the brilliant execution of the drills. But what did I see? The extreme speed of the maneuvers had disrupted both gentlemen's added accessories. The colonel's horse's false tail had partly come loose. The base, a wad of tow, trailed near the ground like a distaff, while the fake hairs stuck straight up several feet in the air, fanning out across the horse's rump like a peacock's tail. As for Captain B, scarf pads, pressed by his saddle's flaps, they had slipped down his shins without him noticing, bulging awkwardly over his bones, creating a bizarre effect, while the captain, proudly upright in his saddle, seemed to say, "Look at me, admire my beauty. It's hard to stay serious at 20. I couldn't hold in my laughter at the ridiculous sight before me, and despite the presence of 3 high-ranking generals, I burst out into loud, uncontrollable laughter. I bent over my saddle, bit the sleeve of my dolman, but nothing helped. I laughed until my side hurt. The Inspector General, unaware of the cause of my laughter, ordered me out of the ranks and placed me under confinement. I obeyed, but as I had to pass between the colonel and Captain B, his horses, my eyes couldn't help returning to that dreadful tail and those peculiar calves, and I burst out laughing again, more uncontrollably than ever. The generals must have thought I'd gone mad. Once they left, the regiment's officers gathered around the colonel and Captain B, learned what had happened, and laughed just as hard, though more freely. Commander Blancheville attended Madame Gouden's salon that evening. When General Boursier mentioned what he called my incident, Mr. Blancheville explained the reason behind my uncontrollable laughter. Upon hearing the story, the generals, the ladies, and the entire staff burst into tears of laughter, and the merriment doubled when handsome Captain B walked in, having properly readjusted his fake calves, unaware he was the cause of the uproar. General Boursier realized that if he had laughed so hard just hearing the story, it was only natural for a young second lieutenant to have done the same when witnessing it. He lifted my confinement and sent for me immediately. As soon as I entered the drawing room, the Inspector General and the entire assembly broke into a loud peal of laughter, in which my memories of the morning made me join heartily. The joy reached its peak when Captain B, still clueless, went from guest to guest, asking what was so funny, while everyone looked at his calves. That concludes the 16th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.